Hi guys, my name is Eve and welcome to my channel. Today I will be talking about the best books I read in 2020. But before we dive into the actual list, I have some honorable mentions for you that were just too good to be left unmentioned, and I would really like you to know about them. They are also accidentally the two only literary fiction books I will have on my list, because in 2020 I predominantly read fantasy books. Fantasy and historical fiction will be what you will see in the top 10 later on. So let's dive into the honorable mentions. The first book I want to talk about today is Only Americans Burn in Hell by Jared Kovac. Yes, let that sink in. You might remember that before the virus, there were other disturbing things happening in the world, like TV stars running the White House, democracy and dignity being more like afterthoughts in the world, stuff like that. Jared Kovac decided to write a book about that. And the story that he produced is a satire, a non-fiction book, a fantasy book, and a memoir all in one. Between bits and pieces of Jared Kovac's life as a writer with a Muslim migration background in the US, we get a very, very weird story about Amazon killer queens going around in LA. There is a dubious but well-meaning billionaire sheikh doing stuff that we don't really understand, but it's funny. And we get a lot of infos about, for example, the publication industry and really big companies like Twitter, Facebook, and what the Bertelsmann Group, for example, did in war times. And if you always wanted to know who is actually earning money when you're attending a cultural event, then you should also read this book. It's absolutely strange. It's hilarious, super informative. I have been laughing the whole time, and it was as good as any other non-fiction book, actually. You find, after having finished the book, that this is what explains the world. I really, really loved it, and I hope more people will pick it up. I never see anyone talking about it online, and maybe you want to pick it up in the future. I hope so. It's absolutely great. The second of the honorable mentions is Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. Now, as far as I know, this was a New York Times bestseller, so I cannot say that not many people know about it. It has also been a topic of loads of booktubers online last year, but sometimes I think it's really nice to mention when a book lived up to the hype. This is a story about a girl abandoned by her own family to live alone in the marsh of North Carolina in the 1960s. She will be entangled in a murder case of a boy who supposedly loved her in the village close to the marsh. So this is a murder mystery, but also a brilliant depiction of loneliness and the deep connection to nature that most of us living in urban areas have lost. It also shows how deeply rooted prejudices against minorities are, because you can see how they try to make Kaya the responsible person for the murder in this story. I thought it was very moving, beautifully written, especially whenever the main character Kaya interacts with the marshlands and the animals living there. I think that the story had such a surprising and very, very satisfying end. Absolutely highly recommended. And now let's dive into the list of the 10 best books I read in 2020. I really enjoyed all of them, so it actually doesn't matter much which rank each of them received here, except of maybe the top 3 books, because they were the most surprising to me last year. With the exception of one, all of the books were written by authors who were new to me, so some of them I found on BookTube, for example, and others were household names I finally wanted to check out myself. Starting with number 10, a rather recent read from December 2020, the book was also just published in autumn last year, is Kingdom of the Wicked by Carrie Maniscalco. We follow twin sisters Vittoria and Emilia, who are undercover witches in Palermo, Italy. When Vittoria gets brutally murdered, her sister Emilia summons a demon who unfortunately is also one of the 7 princes of hell. The one she summons is Wrath, and he is not very amused to be tied to a witch in the mortal world now. However, he still helps her to find the killer and why this is happening in the first place, because there are more girls murdered, not just Vittoria. As you can imagine, there is a lot of banter, forbidden dark magic, and a budding enemies to lovers trope I enjoyed as much as the Mediterranean setting. All of the references to the food and the weather, it was like going on holidays in a fantasy book. I really, really loved it, and I cannot wait for the second installment to be published this year in October. And on a side note, I just have to mention it, the cover artwork is just fantastic, right? Number 9 goes to The Binding by Bridget Collins. By the way, this was all the rage in 2019. We follow Emmett, who recently became a bookbinder's apprentice. Now, bookbinding in this world is no ordinary profession. You go to a bookbinder to leave a secret or something that you just want to forget, and they bind it into a book. Once you have done so, you forget it. Also, that you actually met the binder for doing so. One day, Emmett finds a book with his name on it. And of course, he doesn't remember anything about that. And that's where the story actually begins, because he tries to retrieve the memory. I practically devoured the second half of this book and I couldn't put it down. The suspense was unbearable and I just wanted to know whether he will succeed in getting back the book and so filling the gaps of his own story. I thought the idea of leaving a part of your soul in a book fascinating, and of course we question the morality of the trade and what it does to people in general the whole time. I thought this was absolutely fantastic and it deserves all the praise it got. Next up at number 8, we have Legendary by Stephanie Garber, which is book number 2 in the Caraval trilogy. I have also read the last installment, Finale, in 2020, which was a bit too saccharine for my taste, but I would still recommend the whole series to everyone, especially because I always talk about this one as being the perfect material for a Netflix show or a film adaptation. Obviously, I cannot say too much about Legendary since it is a sequel, but Caraval centers around two sisters, Scarlett and Donatella, who live on an isolated island with their father. In this world, every other year there is an event called Caraval, which is part of a play and a competition hosted by the master magician Legend. He will grant a wish to whoever wins the game, and Scarlett tries to get the invitation to the competition because she wants to find her mother who went missing years ago. I love the whimsical carnivalesque atmosphere, the twists and the turns and the magic and the tricky love interests. In terms of YA fantasy, I think this is top notch. In 2020, I decided to pick up the first novels of some of the most famous fantasy series out there, just to check whether I might be part of the fandom in the future as well. Some of these experiments unfortunately ended on my most disappointing reads of 2020, which I will be posting soon, but the following 2 entries in my list grabbed the pole position in that category and made me super excited to read more in their respective universes. So number 7 goes to The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch, which is book number 1 in the Gentleman Bastard sequence. This is more an adventure or crime story than it is a fantasy. At least the fantastical and magical elements are limited and not exactly the focus of the story. We are following our main character Locke and his group of friends who are essentially thieves posing as acolytes of a priest in one of the temples in the city. They like to pose and stage dramatic coups to rob the rich population in a setting reminiscent of the Medici era of Italy. The story takes us to one of these heists, and at the same time there is a serious conflict disturbing the gangs ruling the underground, which they actually belong to as well, and Locke would like to ignore. As you can imagine, the story will make sure that he will not ignore what's going on there. The characters are basically greedy idiots, but we just have to adore them. There's great friendship, banter, and a really, really good time until there is not, and violence breaks out, and we have to fear for the lives of the protagonists and just hope that everything will be alright in the end. By the end of the book, I had no idea where the author actually could continue. So I'm so excited to pick up the next book as soon as possible and find out. The same situation we have at number 6, which is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie, the first book in the First Law trilogy. Joe Abercrombie has dedicated followers, and I'm so happy to join the choir. Lord Grimdark, though he doesn't like to be called like this, writes some of the most intriguing characters in fantasy literature, who actually carry the book even if on the surface not much is happening plot-wise. This is at least true for The Blade Itself, which functions as an introduction of the characters who end end up meeting each other in the capital of the world to begin a quest. We have an old magician, a former infamous warrior, a crippled inquisitor, and a young fop of a nobleman who actually just wants to impress his father and nothing else. All of the characters are flawed. Some of them are hilarious, although they want to be taken seriously, and there are great misunderstandings and a wonderful representation of human nature, cruelty, selfishness, and the most noble feelings possible, all there for us to be explored. And the whole time, you're waiting at the edge of your seat when we will get to know what will actually happen in the series. And then it is time for book number 2. And you're not even a bit frustrated. I think that's an accomplishment, and I hope that book number 2 will show me what the plot of the series actually is. Next up on number 5 is Lancelot by Giles Christian. I consider myself very lucky that I found this book months ago mentioned in a TBR video of another booktuber, because I was instantly intrigued by the idea to tell the Arthurian legend from the perspective of King Arthur's most famous knight, whose destiny it was to respect and yet betray him. Besides this, I like historical fiction, which I have not read enough of last year, and so Lancelot's life was a welcome respite from all the magic I was reading about. There is magic here as well, but it's more connected to Celtic druids and so a kind of shamanism. Merlin is there, the Lady of the Lake, and of course Guinevere, and Lancelot will love her and will be forever haunted by the wish to make her his own. The battle scenes in this book are very detailed, and the focus lies on Lancelot's life as a warrior. So all of you who like swords and chivalry and to learn about historical events, no matter whether myth or fact, you get it all. I like the tragedy of Lancelot's life, the yearning and the never really having, and the dedication to follow what was foretold as his destiny. And all of this was so superbly embedded into the Old Britain written by the author. I could almost feel the wind tearing at my hair while the knights were riding side by side with their king. I was so impressed that I bought the next standalone in the Arthurian cycle by Giles Christian right away, and it's sitting on my shelf waiting for spring to come when I will continue the journey with him. Speaking of vivid imagery and enchanting atmosphere, number 4 on this list continues in the midst of a place that could easily be the British Isles. I'm talking about The Queens of Innislear by Tessa Grattan. This is a Shakespeare retelling of his play King Lear. The 3 witch daughters of the king will cause discontent and destruction on the island because they all want to become queen after his death. The book is very character-driven, full of magic. Also the dark forces of wild nature, which are actually embodied by the sisters themselves. We have love and betrayers, redemption seekers, and people hungry for power, and it all in the end reads more like a piece of literary fiction than just high fantasy. I love the intensity of everything in this story, from the storms ravaging the island to the deep grief of losing a husband, for example, no matter how vain he was. It is a wonderful drama, and I loved it, really. We are entering the top 3 of 2020 now. These books I enjoyed reading the most last year because they either suited my mood at that time perfectly, surprised me with their plot, or left a long-lasting positive impression. So that doesn't mean they necessarily had superior prose or the most magnificent ideas, for example. I just think of them fondly, like remembering a good friend. If the next book was a friend, he would have been hot, because number 3 is From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. Yes, it is that book again, the one that everyone, their mother and their dog have been reading in 2020 in the fantasy community. We are following Poppy, who is the maiden in her world, not to be touched, spoken, or having fun with until she ascends to save the nation. Nobody actually knows what the ascension is or does, but that actually doesn't matter, because Poppy is tired of life without parties and fighting and kicking ass. She ends up getting a new guard who shall protect her from everyone who either wants to kill or kidnap or heaven forbid touch her, which doesn't mean that he keeps his hands to himself. Enter the steamy romance and a confusing but super entertaining mix of maybe vampires, zombie, werewolves, you name it. It was a wild ride and exciting, although the most tropey story that you can imagine. But there was always a kind of twist, so you never completely got what you predicted before. I think I read this in one weekend, and I already have the sequel sitting on my shelf, but I'm saving this for times when the lockdown blues hits hardest again. So yes, it is a treat. If you want some steam, banter and blood, I think this could be your next read. Speaking of blood, let's go to number 2, The Beautiful by Renée Ahdieh, which is set in 1872 in New Orleans and centers around our main protagonist Celine, who escaped her old life in Paris to start a new and hopefully respectable life in the New World. The nuns at the convent she stays shall make sure of that by finding her a good husband and driving her into the arms of faith. Let's say Celine prefers the dark and mysterious. She will end up making the most inappropriate acquaintances, La Cour de Lion, a group of beautiful people who dine in the most lavish restaurants and party all night. They also belong to the underground, shady business and murders included. People die around Celine. Will she be the next one? Did you already get the Anne Rice vibes? No? I forgot. There is a slightly cold, arrogant, attractive man with a French name involved. Sébastien Saint-Germain. Now you get the vampires, right? I am a huge Anne Rice fan, and I could not resist picking up this book to drown again in the shadows of the French Quarter, the monsters lurking behind the iron fences of the mansions, every sin only one step away. It reminded me of endless hours spent reading the Vampire Chronicles and the Gothic I love in general. This book, however, is not like the Vampire Chronicles. It is more like a murder mystery, a Gothic tale, but also kind of new take on the vampire trope because there are other supernatural beings involved. And actually, until the end, we are not sure who is who and who is what. Although you think there might be vampires or maybe werewolves, you actually don't know until things unravel and we see how Celine is getting to be a part of this. The book has an extreme cliffhanger that forces you to buy the next book, and I thought that was the only negative point about this book. She could have been a bit more subtle there and ease us into the next book. She chose a different way, and at least she got me, right? I already bought the second book. It's sitting on my shelf. It's looking down on me. I saved it for my birthday, which is in February, and the continuation of the story will be my favorite present in lockdown. I'm sure of it. And finally, we have arrived at my number 1 pick of 2020, and the most surprising for me since it was the unholy Amazon algorithm that suggested this book to me. And so far, I have only seen one booktuber mention it briefly in a TBR video. I'm talking about Enchanté by Gita Trellis. Here my love for historical fiction meets fantasy because we follow a young woman in Paris right before the French Revolution. Camille uses petty magic tricks to provide for her younger sister and her gambling brother since their parents died years ago and left the siblings in poverty. One day she finds a dark magic object in their attic which can transform her into a baroness. Camille then decides to infiltrate the court of Marie Antoinette at Versailles to gamble and steal from the wealthy aristocrats. But as you can imagine, dark magic always comes at a price, and she might not be the only one at court who's not what she seems to be. I found the book absolutely wonderful. I loved all of the things that happened to Camille at Versailles, you know, the splendor, the parties, the games they are playing in the gardens of Versailles. There are intrigues, betrayals, and her love interest, for example, is of a mixed ethnic background, which you actually see not that often represented in a book like that. And everything takes place while the city is slowly moving towards the uprising, which we will know changed the world a long time after. And there's also a new invention, the balloon ride, that plays a role in the story. And I think this is a beautiful metaphor for the journey to freedom and the unknown in general. The second book, Liberté, will be published in February. I really can't wait to hold this in my hands. I already pre-ordered it. The publication date cannot come soon enough for me. So guys, this was my list of the books I enjoyed most in 2020. I hope you found your next entry for future TBRs and enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and I talk to you soon. Bye bye!